Well, when you are at a summit and when you meet someone, you say, oh, I know this guy because I've learned a lot from this guy and I want to know more about the advertising world from this guy. Well, all of us can guess whom are we talking about? Sir Martin Sorrell. So nice to meet you.
That was a
in
good
Riyadh.
build-up. Totally out of sync with reality,
But that
was a good
represents
build-up.
you. But that represents
That was
you.
BS, as we call it.
So there is a lot of yes, no, and I don't know about the advertising. What should we start with? Yes, no, or I don't know?
All three.
So what is the yes? Which way the ad market is moving?
Well, the ad market is growing. It came down as a percentage of GDP globally, but has started to move up again, and it's been driven by digital. This year, for the first time, clients will spend $1 trillion globally, excluding mainland China. And of that $1 trillion, $700 billion is digital and $300 billion is traditional. The overall industry will probably grow this year by about 7 or 8% in nominal terms. Digital will grow by at least double that, and traditional will be flat or down. If you have live sport and you're traditional, like last year, if you were Disney or ESPN or Fox, your downdraft, your reduction in ad revenue is about 0 to 5%. If you were Discovery Warner, when you didn't have live sport, you'd be down 10 or 15%. Pattern will be very similar this year. On the other hand, digital this year is up probably 15, 20%. The Mag 7 are reporting, I think Google is actually reporting today. So we'll see what happened in Q3. But Q1 and Q2, the platforms were up by 10, 15, 20%. So it's a tale of two cities. Depends where you're looking. If you look at that $1 trillion, who's the biggest media seller? Well, it's Alphabet, with about 250 billion this year versus 225 last year. So they've grown significantly. Meta will be 125%. Meta's 15%, 150 billion. And Amazon this year probably be about 60 billion, having been 50 billion last year. Meta last year 125. So you can see the three Western platforms have all grown very significantly and will continue to do so this year. The E3 Eastern platforms, Alibaba, Tencent and ByteDance, we don't have great data on Alibaba and Tencent, mainland China, but ByteDance we know is 150 billion, so they'll be as big as Meta this year, including mainland China. Outside of mainland China, ByteDance or TikTok will be 40 billion. Last year it was 20 billion, and the year before it was 10. So it's doubled up these last years, and of course they have the problem with the Supreme Court. They have to go to the Supreme Court on a free speech platform to see whether they retain ownership, the Chinese retain ownership. My sense is if they lose the Supreme Court decision, they'll probably deep six. I don't think they'll want the US platform in any Mnuchin's hands or anybody else's hands for that matter. So, and that if it's, of the 40 billion this year, let's say 20 is the US, that means 150 goes to 130. So I think that's the way they'll go. And like maybe China as a whole, they're starting to penetrate more the global south, the BRICS, of which India is a part, and they're going more now for the 60 trillion of world GDP that's outside China and outside the US. So that's the pattern. And, agencies, including agencies in India, tell their clients the world's got more complex. I disagree. The world's has got simpler. Those 6 platforms dominate, to answer your question about what's happening. And then if you add Microsoft, which is doing about 19 billion, or what, as best as we can figure out from the published numbers, Apple at about 10 or 11, then you drop down to a Snap at 5.5, a Pinterest around 4, Walmart with its wall garden about 3, retail advertising, digital advertising, 3 billion, and Twitter was 5, but of course under Musk now it's shrunk probably to about 1.5, maybe, or 2. But the point of going through those stats is those 6 platforms, the 3 Western and the 3 Eastern, are dominant. And with AI, Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, I think Oracle, Salesforce, and Adobe, IBM, SAP maybe, but those companies, together with those 6 platforms, are going to be, Microsoft are going to be the real dominant companies. And the money that you need, as you see here at conferences like FII, the money you need for compute power, for energy, mean those companies will become even more powerful, I think. They are $3 trillion companies, which is as big as countries. You equate market cap with GDP, you could say they're as big as European countries, certainly. So big as, almost as big as Germany, as big as the UK or France or Italy or Spain. So these companies will get bigger. There will be people who obviously grow, like Musk, and you never count them out. But basically, these companies will continue, I think, to be the strong men or strong women of the industry.
Yeah. You've always spoken about the evolution curve,
Yeah.
which is that companies, when they take a birth, they are infant, then they become youth, then they are mature, and then they're declining.
Old age.
Which part of the advertising world do you think now has hit what could be called as a mature curve, and which part has hit what could be called
the
declining
traditional,
curve?
that 300 billion, which is under huge pressure. I mean, I can remember a time in the UK where press advertising fell by 25% a year for 2 years. So it lost half of its market power within 2 years. The traditional advertising, I mean, we touched on in our prep for this, how younger people are receiving their news, for example. And it's quite clear, if you look at the conflicts that are going on at the minute, the figurative conflicts like the US-China relationship, or lack of it, what's going on around Ukraine with Russia, or Russia as a whole, Iran and the Middle East and its proxies. If you look at that, a lot of that news is disseminated by those platforms I mentioned. And a lot of people look at TikTok, for example, and the growth of TikTok. It's not just TikTok, or Facebook, or Instagram, or Telegram, or whatever it happens to be. People are receiving their news in totally different ways to the ways that not you, but certainly I was used to receiving. So we trust different channels and different ways of reaching consumers. And it's very difficult. This is like automobile manufacturing. It's like the banks dealing with fintech. It's like the mature Western automobile manufacturers dealing with Chinese EVs and AVs, autonomous vehicles. It involves huge disintermediation and change. And if you have an established business, repositioning that established business when these pressures are coming on, it make it extremely different.
So what we've discussed so far are perhaps ways of distribution, how they're changing.
Yeah.
But your key insight always has been centered around customer. What does the consumer need? Looking at the advent of technology, speed of information,
Yes.
connectivity of internet, what has changed permanently in a customer's mindset?
Well, we've gone from an era of mass communication. You communicating as a manufacturer or a retailer or a wholesaler on a mass basis to highly individualized communication. Those 6 platforms that I mentioned have huge amounts of first-party data, and they create signals for the users of those platforms that they can use together with their first-party data to reach people on a highly personalized basis. So, for example, our relationship with General Motors, they've totally transformed their marketing approach, going to a much more AI technology-driven approach, which is highly personalized. To cut to the chase, it's what I call Netflix on steroids.
Okay.
Any Netflix subscriber knows that if you pick a film and you stop midway, you'll get an email saying to you, or a message saying to you, why did you stop? If you didn't like it, you might be interested in that. Or even if you finish the film, you like that, you may be interested in more content like this. The other interesting thing, in an Indian context, is that the streamers, whether it be Netflix, Amazon, Disney, or whatever, Univision, they are all producing local content, which is actually probably more effective in connecting with consumers than global content. There's another sort of, not hidden lesson, but lesson there, I think, for media owners. But essentially, the big shift, whether it be around copywriting and visualization, so art direction and copywriting, or around media planning and buying, or general efficiency, or spreading knowledge, the big shift is it's all becoming very highly personalized. I can communicate with you. I know what your media habits are from the signals from the platforms. I know what you like and you don't like. I know from my first-party data, if I've got good integrated first-party data, what you bought, what you like, or whatever, and I can match that on a timely basis or whatever. My favorite always used to be, if it started snowing, you would send people ads for snow tires. So the context for the communication is highly personalized and highly relevant to what you're thinking and what you're doing. Sometimes it becomes annoying.
Yes.
And we have to watch for that. But as the volume increases of communication, the need for creative ways of delivering that content is going to get even greater.
My last but one question, and I'll throw a direct one at you. In context of brands, you understand brands and the cycle of brands. Out of the pool of brands managed by you or not managed by you, which are 2 or 3 brands you think will always exist? Which are the brands which you think new could become big, and which are the brands which may in a sense are fading away?
Well, I'm not going to insult anybody by saying who's fading. But
Well, all the more reason you should say because they need you.
It's a really interesting question because my view, just personalize it. Okay. My dad said to me, right, find an industry that you love, find a company inside that industry you love, and go and work for them. If you fancy doing something on your own at some point, when you're 40 years old or whatever, go ahead and do it. But the point behind that was my dad thought about long brand cycles, to your point. I can't remember what the stat was that McKinsey, they looked at the S&P 500 or the FTSE 100 and said the churn rate, I think on average was about 12 or 13 years, whatever it was, okay? So the churn, but that pace of change is accelerating. I saw the futurist from JP Morgan. She's based in Buenos Aires, a very interesting woman. She looks for early signals.
Okay.
But what she said was, to the group I was with, she said, your kids and your grandchildren are going to experience in 10 years what you've experienced in 50 years. So the pace of change is increasing. So to your point, if we think the product life cycles or brand cycles have shortened, they're going to shorten even further. So, my view, let me focus on the digital side for me. It's what those companies I mentioned, Alphabet, Meta, Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, those 6, for example, together with Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, I didn't mention NVIDIA and I should have done, Adobe, Oracle, Salesforce, they will always, I think, be very strong because they have very great brand strengths in a world where capital is going to be really important and scale is going to be very important. So I think despite the fact that brand cycles are under pressure and they're going to be shorter, to your point, I think these companies really have heft. And from a regulatory point of view, just linking it to regulation, it's very difficult for governments to move as fast as these companies. I remember Lena Khan saying to a conference that she just secured another 300 people by extra funding from the Biden administration. And I saw people in the audience smirk a little bit about that because 300 is a drop in the ocean in the context of the companies we're talking about. So from a regulation point of view, self-regulation and partnership between government and the company, unless they go for Armageddon, Standard Oil breakup or a AT&T breakup, unless they go for that, it's going to have to be a joint thing. So to answer your question, I think these new wave companies are probably going to have longer life cycles because what AI, blockchain, quantum computing, et al., metaverse, much maligned metaverse, which I think is underhyped now, that though these things need compute power, they need power, electricity. So I think that the scale of capital needs are huge. You look at what's happening here with FII. Why will Saudi Arabia be a third power in AI? Look at the power that it has, literally the power that it has, and what it can do with solar power and renewables, etc., along with fossil fuel, in order to provide that capacity. So I think, in a way, things have shortened, but in the digital world, I think these companies are going to remain extremely strong. There will be the Musks, there will be the Altmans, but I mean, Altman really has aligned his flag with Microsoft, as G42 have done, as Mistral has done. So there's a coalescing here of scale and size in the new industries.
My last question actually. If Sir Martin Sorrell of 2024 meets Martin Sorrell of 1990s, and if Sir Martin Sorrell has to write a letter to the Martin Sorrell of 1990s,
what advice would he give?
What advice would there be?
Well, I would say, I've always said learn Chinese.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe we should learn Indian dialects. Because, population for a minute. I noticed the Indian population birth rate has fallen in the southern states, and it's an object of concern. But, the population forecasts are really interesting. For China, 1.4 billion down to 770 by the end of the century. For India, doubling.
It's doubling.
Right. So there's going to be huge shifts to make. But I would say learn Chinese and maybe some of those Indian dialects. I would say learn Spanish.
Okay.
That will offend the Brazilians who are Portuguese, but learn Spanish because of the importance of Latin America. Learn code. And maybe learn Arabic as well, because if you think about what's happening, I mean, AI can probably do all of those things. You don't have to learn them, but I think you have to understand. What I'm saying is, two things rule our lives: geography and technology. And the world now is very different to what it was in 1990. That was Ted Levitt. Consumers will consume everything in the same way everywhere. Globalization. I'm not saying that's over, but I think two things. One is our clients and ourselves have to pick our geographies. That's why I'm bullish on India. I'm bullish on North and South America. I'm bullish on the Middle East. And I'm bullish on Asia, with a qualifier on China because of the Taiwan risk. So if you're big in China, do you really want to be defined by 15 to 20% of sales? Do you want to be bigger given that risk? But then India obviously comes more into play: Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, and Malaysia. Africa, to me, is still too volatile. I'm going to upset people by saying that. More conflicts in Africa at the moment than we've ever had. And Europe lacks growth. It has scale, which is important, but it lacks growth. Most of our clients look at Europe as a cost opportunity. And the difference between 24 and 90 is that the economy is still going to grow, the world economy, but it will grow slower than it did before. Inflation is more structural. Larry Fink said that in the opening session as well, and I totally agree. It's much more structural than people think, and interest rates are going to be higher. With that scenario, it means you have to select your geographies much more carefully. And the second thing is you have to use technology, as they're doing here in the kingdom, in Saudi, and in the region. You have to use technology to improve the efficiency and effectiveness, particularly in Europe.
Well, Sir Martin Sorrell, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us.
Very
Thank you
good.
very much,
Good
sir.
to see you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very much. Such a pleasure.